The world had long accepted one truth: the billionaire's only child was born blind. Doctors called it irreversible. Reporters once described it as a tragedy money couldn't fix. Even within the tall gates of the sprawling Wakefield estate, the whispers were the same: the girl would never see sunlight, never know color, never recognize her father's face. For years, no one questioned it. Not the physicians who came and went in expensive cars, not the private tutors who stayed only a few weeks, not even the servants who moved silently through the echoing halls. The mansion existed like a world preserved in glass, perfectly still, perfectly lifeless. In the heart of that silence sat a child. She spent her days near the grand window, a vast sheet of glass that overlooked gardens she could not see. Her small hands traced the edge of her worn teddy bear, the only softness in a home of marble and stone. Sunlight poured in, warm and gold, but it stopped just short of her eyes. Her father often watched from a distance, hidden behind the doorway, a tall figure framed by shadows. His empire stretched across continents, but this single room, this single fragile life, was the one thing he could never control. Each morning, he followed the same ritual. Open the curtains, describe the color of the sky to her, guide her fingers along the breakfast plate, then leave for an office he no longer cared about. He spoke in a voice that sounded like an apology. She never answered. The mansion itself seemed to have learned her silence. Every sound was careful, rehearsed: the shuffle of Maid's shoes, the faint hum of air conditioning, the clock that dared not tick too loudly. Even the birds outside seemed to know better than to sing near her window. They said the girl's mother had died the night she was born. A storm. A helicopter crash. Some said the shock of grief had aged the billionaire overnight. Others said he had gone mad, withdrawing from the world, building walls of wealth to hide his sorrow. But in truth, he hadn't gone mad. He had gone still, frozen in guilt, his days arranged around one fragile heartbeat that could never fully meet his gaze. In the rare moments he looked directly at her, he saw something that terrified him. Her eyes. They were not lifeless, not empty, just distant, searching, like they remembered something the doctors had forgotten. Every specialist, every test, every desperate attempt had ended the same way: permanent, irreversible blindness. The verdict echoed through the years until it became a part of the house itself. And so, he stopped trying. The child grew older, her world defined by sound and touch. The rustle of leaves meant summer. The hum of the radiator meant winter. She listened instead of seeing, memorized footsteps, recognized the rhythm of her father's breathing, and traced the patterns of rain against her windowpane. But within that same house, somewhere between the polished floors and the locked medical cabinets, lay something else. Something no one had noticed, because no one had looked closely enough. The mansion's staff changed quietly over the years. People came, worked, and left without leaving a trace. Some said the atmosphere drained them. Others whispered that strange things happened in the East Wing: drawers that were locked, rooms never used, cabinets filled with prescriptions that never ran out. But no one asked questions. They were paid too well to wonder. Then, one autumn morning, a small change entered that unchanging world. A car stopped at the far end of the driveway. A woman stepped out, modest clothes, tired eyes, a folded letter in her hand. The wind pulled gently at her hair as she looked up at the house. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't from the agencies that usually sent staff to places like this. She had no impressive resume, no elite references. What she did have was something else, a quietness that wasn't born of obedience, but of loss. The guards checked her letter, made a brief call, and opened the gates. She walked in slowly, her steps careful, her gaze low. From one of the upper windows, the child tilted her head, as if she had heard something different that morning. A sound that didn't belong. Inside, the woman was led through the vast corridors, portraits staring down from gilded frames, chandeliers hanging like frozen tears. She said little, only nodded when spoken to. But her eyes, gentle, observing, took in every corner of the mansion. The billionaire met her briefly in his study. He barely looked up from the papers on his desk. Her presence was insignificant to him, just another name to fill another vacant role. But something about her silence caught him off guard. She didn't try to impress, didn't speak unless necessary. When asked why she wanted the job, she simply said, "I need to be somewhere quiet." He nodded, uninterested in the story behind those words. By evening, she was given a room near the servants' quarters, a plain uniform, and a list of duties. No one told her much about the child, only that she was fragile, unpredictable, and must never be startled. She followed instructions, moving through the house like a shadow. That night, when the mansion fell silent, she stood by her small window, looking out at the distant lights of the city. They flickered faintly, like stars she could almost reach. Somewhere above her, on the upper floor, the child lay awake, eyes open, unseeing, listening to the same wind brushing the same walls. Two strangers, separated by stories they didn't yet know, breathing under the same roof of secrets. Morning came quietly. The new maid began her first day. She carried a small basket of linens down the hall, footsteps light, careful not to disturb. At the far end, she passed the grand window, and stopped. The girl was there, sitting in her usual place, her small hand resting on the teddy bear's head. The maid froze, unsure if she should speak. The child's head tilted slightly, sensing the presence of someone new. Neither moved. For a long, fragile moment, time held its breath. And in that silence, between the sound of folded linen and the soft flutter of curtains, something invisible passed between them. Not a word. Not a gesture. Just a faint, inexplicable pull, like recognition. Everyone believed the child was blind. Everyone believed she lived in darkness. But from where the maid stood, sunlight slipped through the window and caught the child's eyes, and for just a heartbeat, they flickered. Barely. Faintly. But they did. The maid blinked, uncertain if she'd imagined it. The child turned her face slightly toward the light. Outside, the wind shifted. And for the first time in years, the mansion, that silent, sleeping monument to sorrow, seemed to breathe again. Morning spread across the mansion like liquid gold, pouring through spotless glass and bouncing off marble floors. The place looked alive under light, yet nothing stirred but servants who moved as carefully as reflections. Every step was a whisper, every task rehearsed. At the far end of the dining hall, the billionaire sat alone before a table built for 20. Silverware gleamed, untouched. He read a newspaper he never finished, his gaze skimming headlines without meaning. Markets rose, deals closed, companies thrived, none of it mattered here. He lifted a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Across from him, a smaller chair stood empty. Always empty. Down the corridor, faint laughter from the kitchen tried to escape, but the marble swallowed it whole. The house had learned to mute itself around him, as if every echo might reopen an old wound. After breakfast he walked the long hallway toward his daughter's room. The air there always smelled faintly of medicine and lilac soap. Nurses had once filled it with machinery, blinking monitors, whispered consultations. Now only silence remained, a silence he both feared and needed. The child sat by the window, as she always did, face tilted toward warmth she couldn't see. Her fingers explored the edge of a wooden puzzle, tracing shapes she had memorized years ago. He stood at the doorway, the same ritual every day. "Good morning," he said softly. A pause. Nothing. He crossed to her side, guided her hand to the spoon on the tray. She felt for it, found it, and nodded faintly. That tiny nod broke him every time. Outside, gardeners trimmed hedges that no one admired. The property was perfect down to its last leaf, but perfection was useless here. Wealth couldn't heal what was broken, it only built taller walls around it. He looked at his daughter's eyes, blue, still, searching. Once, they had seemed to catch the light, but the doctors had called it reflex, not vision. He wanted to believe otherwise, but belief had betrayed him before. He turned away, his reflection ghosting across the window glass. Behind that reflection, the maid moved quietly through the corridor, carrying a bucket of linens. She didn't notice him, he didn't notice her. Two lives crossing like shadows that hadn't yet learned they belonged to the same story. When the workday began, the billionaire's car rolled down the long driveway like a ghost ship leaving harbor. Drivers, gardeners, assistants, all knew to keep their eyes down as he passed. The engine's hum was the only sound of departure, fading into the hush that settled once he was gone. Inside, the mansion exhaled its loneliness. Polished floors reflected chandeliers that glittered for no one. Portraits of ancestors lined the stairway, faces that looked proud, unblinking, untouched by time. Dust never dared to gather here, even decay seemed intimidated by wealth. Yet beneath the polish lived a deep weariness, as if the walls themselves remembered laughter that had long since died. The child's world was smaller, a playroom lined with muted toys, each arranged by size and texture. She knew them by touch, the velvet rabbit, the smooth wooden horse, the puzzle with missing pieces. Music boxes sat unopened, their melodies were too cheerful, too cruel. She preferred the soft hum of the radiator and the way footsteps echoed differently depending on who entered. Afternoons belonged to silence. Tutors came and went, teaching lessons she could not see. Their voices were kind but distant, their time brief. The last one had left a note on the desk, "She is intelligent beyond measure, but she listens too much." No one had understood what that meant. Downstairs, the new maid learned the rhythm of the house. Sheets to fold, floors to polish, meals to prepare. Everything done in measured silence. But she moved slower than the others, not from laziness but from listening. She felt the hollowness beneath each polished surface, the echo that lingered where warmth should have been. At dusk, the sky outside turned amber, and long beams of light filtered through the high windows. The rays crawled across the marble, touching gold frames, gilded handles, untouched pianos. None of it reached the child's eyes. She sat unmoving, a figure carved from patience, waiting for a sound she couldn't name. From his office downtown, the billionaire watched the city's pulse through glass walls. Phones rang, screens blinked, assistants rushed in and out. He nodded to numbers and signatures, but his mind wandered home, to the soft clink of a spoon against porcelain, to the single voice that never answered his. When evening came, he returned to the mansion where lights flickered on automatically, flooding the halls in artificial warmth. He paused at the front door before entering, listening to the stillness pressing against the other side. For a brief moment, he almost turned back. But habit won. He stepped into his museum of memories, each room curated by grief. And somewhere above him, faintly, a laugh, small, unexpected, like glass chiming, escaped from the child's room. He froze. It wasn't the child. It was the maid, humming softly as she changed the bedsheets, unaware that her tune had carried down the stairwell and touched a heart that hadn't felt music in years. Night poured over the estate like ink. The mansion, dazzling in daylight, turned to shadow and reflection. Chandeliers dimmed to faint glows, hallways stretched endlessly, broken only by the whisper of the wind against glass. The billionaire moved through the silence, a tall figure in a black suit loosened at the collar. He carried a tumbler half filled with whiskey that had lost its warmth hours ago. Each step echoed against marble, rebounding off portraits of strangers who bore his name. He stopped at the grand piano in the drawing room. It gleamed, immaculate, untouched since the day his wife's laughter filled this house. His fingers hovered over the keys but didn't press. The silence was safer. Music belonged to another lifetime. In the reflection of the piano's lacquered lid, he saw the ghost of his own face, older than he remembered, eyes dulled, the line of his mouth fixed between pride and regret. The world still called him visionary. Only here, surrounded by everything vision could buy, did he understand what it meant to be blind. Upstairs, the child slept uneasily. Her small breaths made the curtains tremble in rhythm. On the bedside table, a lamp glowed low, casting a thin line of light across her cheek. She turned toward it, as if chasing warmth in a dream. The maid passed by the doorway, pausing when she saw the movement. Something about the child's face, how it softened in that glow, made her step closer. She reached out, adjusted the blanket, brushed a loose curl from the girl's forehead. "Good night," she whispered. The child stirred, not from the sound, but from the vibration in the air. The maid smiled faintly and left the door slightly open. Downstairs, the billionaire poured another drink he didn't need. His gaze drifted to the staircase, where faint humming lingered, a trace of that same melody from earlier. It threaded through the halls like smoke, haunting yet gentle. He followed it unconsciously until he reached the corridor outside the servants' quarters. The door at the end was ajar. Inside, the maid sat by the small window, mending a torn sheet beneath a single lamp. She didn't notice him. The tune she hummed was old, trembling between sorrow and hope. He stood there, invisible, something tightening in his chest. The melody was unfamiliar, yet it reminded him of lullabies he'd forgotten. He wanted to step forward, to ask who she was, why that song sounded like forgiveness. Instead, he turned away. Back in his room, he sank into the chair by the window. Outside, the gardens shimmered faintly under moonlight. The same gardens he'd built to impress a world that had long stopped visiting. He closed his eyes. The tune still echoed, faint but persistent, weaving through marble and shadow until it reached even the quiet space beside his daughter's bed. Somewhere between that hum and the heartbeat of the sleeping house, something changed, subtle as breath. For the first time in years, the silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like waiting. Rain began before dawn, thin and silvery against the tall windows. The air smelled of wet earth, a scent that didn't belong inside a house built to resist the outside world. The maid rose early, wrapping her hair with a plain scarf, her hands still rough from years of smaller work. Down the hall, she met the butler, who recited rules in a low monotone, rooms she could enter, ones she couldn't, the schedule for meals and medicines. She listened without argument, eyes fixed on the way the chandeliers above her trembled when thunder rolled. When he left, she stood alone in the corridor, surrounded by paintings whose eyes followed her. The mansion seemed less like a home and more like a memory trying not to fade. Her first task was the library, dust that never stayed, books no one opened. As she worked, her reflection appeared and disappeared across the glass cabinets, merging with the faces in old photographs. A woman smiling beside the billionaire, a newborn in her arms. The image was dated a week before the crash. The maid's breath caught for a moment. Loss recognized loss. By mid-morning, she carried fresh linen toward the child's room. Soft voices floated from within, one of the nurses reading aloud. The maid paused outside, listening. The story was about colors, blue like the sea, red like love, yellow like the sun. Words the child had learned only as sound. When the reading ended, the nurse excused herself, brushing past the maid without acknowledgement. The door remained half open. The maid stepped inside quietly. The child sat on a rug scattered with wooden toys, head tilted toward the rain sound against the glass. Her eyes, open but distant, reflected nothing. Yet her face was turned perfectly toward the window, as if she knew where the light should be. The maid knelt, gathering fallen blocks. "May I?" she whispered. The girl didn't answer, only reached out a cautious hand. Their fingers brushed. The maid's heart ached at the fragility of that touch, so light, so careful, like the girl feared breaking the air itself. A flash of lightning filled the room. Instinctively, the child flinched. It was small, barely a tremor, but it was movement. The maid froze, eyes widening. Then thunder followed, deep and distant. The girl's face softened, and she smiled faintly, as if the sky had spoken only to her. The maid's voice was barely a breath. "You felt that, didn't you?" No reply. But the child's lips curved again. Outside, the storm gathered strength, rain tracing rivers down the glass like tears the house had kept for too long. By afternoon, the rain eased into a slow drizzle, leaving the world outside washed and quiet. The maid stood by the nursery window, wiping moisture from the sill, watching drops slide down like glass beads. Behind her, the child stacked blocks in neat, careful towers. Every sound was soft enough to be mistaken for silence, the faint clack of wood, the rhythm of breathing, the whisper of fabric as the maid moved. But beneath that calm, something unspoken grew, fragile as a candle flame. The maid spoke suddenly, though she wasn't sure why. "Where I come from, the rain smells like iron." No response, but the child tilted her head, listening. "It used to fall so hard," the maid continued, voice almost to herself, "that my little boy would dance in it." Said the sky was singing. She stopped, realizing what she'd said. The words felt heavier once they left her mouth. The girl's hands had stilled. The maid smiled faintly and resumed her work. She hadn't planned to speak of him. Not here. Not anywhere. But grief has a way of escaping, even in rooms meant for silence. Later, when she went to change the linens, she found the child humming, a simple, tuneless sound, but unmistakable. A hum. It carried the same rhythm the maid had used to soothe her son when the world had been smaller and kinder. She froze, pillow in hand. The sound stopped. The girl's head turned slightly. "You're the one who sang last night," she said softly. The maid's heart skipped. The voice was clear, delicate, like glass not yet cooled. "I didn't know anyone was listening." "I listen," the child said, fingers brushing the air in front of her. "I always listen." The maid knelt beside her. "You like music?" "I like when the house isn't quiet," the girl replied. That night, while others slept, the maid sat on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the world hollow and still. She thought about that small voice, that almost smile, the way the child turned toward sounds as if following invisible light. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded photograph, edges frayed, image fading. A boy with a missing front tooth, caught mid-laugh beneath a crooked umbrella. Her thumb traced his face. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear him laughing in the storm. Down the corridor, the mansion hummed faintly with night machines, the whisper of vents, the heartbeat of generators, the memory of voices. And somewhere between them, she thought she heard it again, that small hum from the child's room, repeating the same notes she'd once sung to someone else. The sound reached her like a promise. For the first time since she'd entered this house, the maid didn't feel like an intruder. She felt needed. Days folded into one another, stitched together by routine. The maid learned the mansion's rhythm, the soft chime announcing mealtime, the hiss of the espresso machine in the kitchen, the distant click of the master's shoes crossing the marble floor. She worked quietly, rarely speaking, but always listening, for the small things no one else noticed. And she listened most to the child. The girl's world was woven entirely from sound. She could tell who entered by the weight of their steps, the scent of their perfume, the way air shifted when a door opened. When the maid came near, her shoulders eased, her face turned toward that familiar softness in the maid's voice. Sometimes the maid read to her. Not from medical manuals or educational texts, but from forgotten storybooks found on a lower shelf. Tales of rivers and stars and colors, the kinds of words that belong to people who can see. One afternoon, as sunlight slid lazily through the curtains, the maid described a meadow. "It's green," she said, pausing to find simpler language. "Like the smell after rain. And when the wind passes through, it looks like the earth is breathing." The child smiled. "I can imagine that," she said, her hands making small waves in the air. Encouraged, the maid continued. "And when the day ends, the sky turns gold. Then red." Then, she stopped. The child was tilting her head, her brows furrowing slightly. "Gold?" the girl asked, uncertain. "Yes, gold," the maid whispered. The child reached toward the window, fingers open. "What does gold sound like?" The maid wanted to answer, but no words came. Instead, she moved to the window, lifted the curtain, and let sunlight fall fully into the room. Dust motes danced in the beam, tiny, spinning galaxies of light. The girl's face changed. Her pupils tightened. It was barely visible, a twitch, a shimmer, but the maid saw it. The child's eyes flinched away from the brightness. She didn't say a word. Her breath caught, she stepped back slowly. The child turned her face again toward the warmth, as if drawn to it. Something stirred inside the maid, sharp and electric. She closed the curtain quietly, her mind racing. Maybe it was chance. Maybe not. That evening, while folding sheets in the laundry room, she kept replaying the moment. The flicker, the movement, the way those pale blue eyes had reacted not to sound, but to light. It couldn't be. The doctors said impossible. The staff said permanent. But the truth, she realized, didn't always live in what people said, it lived in what they refused to see. And as she finished her work, she knew one thing for certain: tomorrow, she would test it again. Morning light crept across the nursery floor in long, patient lines. The child sat on her rug, fingers tracing shapes carved into a wooden toy. The maid watched from the doorway, a basket of folded towels balanced on her hip. She wasn't supposed to linger, but something about the quiet tugged at her again, the way the girl turned her face slightly when the sun shifted, as though listening to light itself. The maid set the basket down and crossed the room. She opened the curtains wider, slowly, letting the sunlight spill through in warm waves. The air filled with the scent of old cotton and lilac soap. The girl's head moved, fractionally, but unmistakably, toward the glow. The maid's heart stumbled. She stood perfectly still, afraid even to breathe. Then she stepped between the girl and the window, blocking the light. The girl frowned, turning her face toward where the light had been, then away, confused. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't chance. The maid let the curtain fall closed again and busied herself with the laundry, hands trembling. "You like it bright in here?" she asked softly. "Yes," the girl replied after a long pause. "It feels warm." The maid smiled faintly, though her pulse thudded in her ears. Warm. She'd said warm, not bright. Still, it was something. Later, as she cleaned the study, the maid's mind spun. She thought about the tiny twitch of pupils, the way the girl had turned toward sunlight. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. The desk drawers were lined with old medical notes. Most she ignored. But one envelope caught her eye, unlabeled, tucked beneath a stack of financial papers. Inside, small glass vials, sealed and half-empty, each with faded stickers marked only by numbers. She turned one toward the light. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, like dust suspended in air. Her hand tightened around it. This wasn't something a child should need. Footsteps approached. She quickly slipped the vial back into place and closed the drawer. That evening, when the mansion settled into its nightly hush, she returned to the child's room. The lamp glowed soft amber. She sat beside the bed, pretending to tidy toys, but her eyes never left the child's. In her pocket, her phone's flashlight waited. She hesitated, then switched it on, a faint beam hidden by her palm. Slowly, she moved it across the floor. The girl's eyes flickered, just a flutter, but they moved. The maid's breath caught. Again. She tried again, this time a little closer. The same reaction. A tremor of awareness. Her throat tightened. Every instinct screamed to run and tell someone, but she couldn't, not yet. Not without proof. She turned off the light, heart pounding. Whatever truth lived in this house, it wasn't blindness. It was something far darker. The next morning, mist hung low over the gardens, turning the world beyond the windows into a pale blur. Inside, the maid worked quickly, her thoughts louder than her footsteps. Every movement from the day before replayed in her mind, the flicker of eyes, the quiet confusion, the undeniable trace of light. She waited until the nurses left, their conversation fading down the corridor. The house sank into its midday stillness. The girl sat in her usual spot near the window, a small wool blanket folded over her knees. The maid approached quietly, pretending to straighten the curtains. She drew them halfway open. Sunlight pooled onto the carpet, touching the girl's hands. The child smiled faintly, palms lifting toward the warmth. "Does it feel nice?" the maid asked. The girl nodded. "It's different today. It feels brighter." The words slid through the maid like a current. Brighter. She moved away quickly, afraid the tremor in her hands would give her away. For days, she tested in small, secret ways. She learned that the girl's eyes followed motion when it was slow and soft. That she blinked when light changed suddenly. That she smiled before sound reached her ears, as if she could see movement before hearing it. At night, the maid searched the study again. This time she carried a small notebook and a sliver of courage. Inside the desk drawers she found more vials, some newer, some old, alongside a folder thick with medical records. The reports repeated the same phrase: condition stable, treatment ongoing. None said improvement. None said why. One name appeared again and again: Dr. Alden Ross. She wrote it down. Far down the hall, a floorboard creaked. She froze, heart hammering. For a moment, she saw a shadow move past the frosted glass of the study door. Slow, deliberate. When it was gone, she slid the folder back and left, steps silent as breath. That night, she sat by her small window, searching the doctor's name on her old phone. The screen glowed blue against her face. Headlines appeared. Clinical trials, pharmaceutical partnerships, quiet settlements. But one article caught her breath: doctor investigated for unapproved experiments involving pediatric patients, case dismissed due to lack of evidence. Her chest tightened. She looked toward the ceiling, where faint vibrations of movement echoed from the floors above. Somewhere up there, the child slept, trusting a world built on lies. The maid locked her phone and closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw the girl's face turn toward sunlight, the faint flicker of awareness breaking through years of manufactured blindness. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was awake. And tomorrow, she promised herself, she would bring it fully into the light. Morning broke clear and golden, the kind of light that filled every edge of the room. The maid entered quietly, her pulse steady, her plan set. Today she would know for sure. The child sat cross-legged on the rug, tracing a ribbon between her fingers. The maid smiled softly and placed a row of colored marbles on the floor, objects the girl was said never to have seen. "Can you help me count them?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. The girl tilted her head. "Count?" "Yes," the maid said. "Just listen to where I put them." She rolled the first marble, letting it click softly against another. The sound was tiny, barely enough to follow. The girl reached toward it, stopping just short, then, after a pause, reached again and touched it exactly. The maid's breath caught. She tried again, rolling a second marble to the opposite side. This time the girl's head turned first, eyes narrowing slightly before her hand followed. Her fingers closed around it without hesitation. The maid's chest filled with equal parts wonder and dread. One last test. She held up the third marble, said nothing, and let the sun strike its surface. The glass caught fire with reflected gold. The girl's pupils tightened. "Beautiful," the child whispered. The word was small, almost lost to air, but it shattered the room's stillness. The maid pressed a hand to her mouth, blinking back tears. "What did you say?" "Beautiful," the girl repeated, voice trembling with awe. "I saw it." The maid knelt quickly beside her, taking her small hands. "You can see the light." The girl nodded, confusion and joy tangled together. "Not always. Only sometimes. It hurts a little, but I see it." 1,000 thoughts collided inside the maid's head: anger, disbelief, relief, terror. All she could manage was a whisper. "They told your father you were blind." The child frowned. "He says I'm perfect the way I am." Perfect. The word felt like a cage. Later that day, the maid walked the garden paths, her mind racing. Every truth she had built her job upon was now cracked. The mansion's beauty, the father's silence, the endless stream of medicine, it all formed a pattern she could finally read. She stopped beneath a willow, gripping the edge of her apron. She thought of the vials, the doctor's name, the court case that had disappeared. Someone had wanted the child to remain blind. Someone had profited from it. As the wind stirred the branches, she lifted her gaze toward the high windows where the girl sat in her patch of sunlight. The child's face was turned outward, eyes half open, a faint smile curving her lips. The maid exhaled, trembling. The truth was now too bright to hide. Tomorrow, she decided, the father would have to know. The next morning came wrapped in silence thick enough to hear a heartbeat. The sky outside was pale, clouds stretching thin like silk across the sun. The maid moved through the corridor slowly, her breath shallow, her steps deliberate. Today she would not only test, she would show. She found the child in her favorite spot beside the window, the same worn teddy bear tucked beneath one arm. A tray of breakfast sat untouched, porridge cooling, juice untouched. The maid knelt beside her. "I want to try something different today," she said softly. The child turned her head. "Something different?" "Yes," the maid replied, forcing a smile. "I think you might like it." She pulled the curtains open, just a little, enough for sunlight to slip through and scatter across the carpet in golden shapes. The girl's eyelashes fluttered. Her breathing changed. The maid held her breath. "Do you feel that?" "Yes," the girl whispered. "It's warm." The maid reached into her pocket, fingers brushing over her phone. She hesitated, then turned on the flashlight and set it gently on the floor. A thin beam stretched across the rug. Slowly, she moved it closer to the child's face, careful not to make a sound. The beam caught the girl's cheek, and her eyes shifted, just slightly, but unmistakably. "Follow it," the maid whispered. The girl did. Her pupils trembled, narrowing as the light crossed them. The maid's throat tightened. "You're seeing it, aren't you?" The child's voice trembled. "I don't know. It's like, it's there, then gone. Like when I dream." Tears blurred the maid's vision. "You can see," she breathed. "Even if just a little, you can." The girl smiled faintly, uncertain. "Is that what seeing feels like?" The maid laughed softly through tears. "It's exactly what it feels like." She wanted to shout, to run through the halls and tell the world what she had just witnessed, but she couldn't, not yet. She had to protect this moment, this fragile miracle, from being crushed by disbelief. She reached out and brushed the child's hair back from her forehead. "You're brave," she said gently. "Braver than anyone I've ever met." The girl tilted her face toward the maid's voice, her eyes searching, unsure but alive. Outside, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds and spilled across the floor, flooding the room in soft gold. The child blinked again, both hands reaching forward as if to touch the warmth. The maid's heart swelled until she thought it might break. For the first time in years, light had entered this house, and someone had seen it. The maid sat frozen, caught between disbelief and wonder. The light stretched across the rug like a path between two worlds, the one everyone believed in, and the one that had just begun to breathe. The child leaned forward, fingers grazing the edge of brightness. "It's warm," she murmured again. "But it's moving." The maid swallowed hard. "Yes. That's the light. What does it look like?" The question broke her. No one had ever asked the maid to describe something so simple, so impossible to explain. "It's like the color of honey," she whispered. "And when it touches you, it shines through everything, like gold that isn't heavy." The girl smiled, her eyes still trembling. I think I saw it." The words hit like thunder. The maid pressed both hands over her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. The girl reached toward the sound. "Why are you crying?" "Because," the maid breathed, "you just did something everyone said you never could." Silence fell between them, heavy and alive. The maid wanted to hold her, to freeze this fragile miracle before the world could take it apart. But the child's face had changed. A crease formed between her brows, a flicker of recognition, or memory. She tilted her head, searching the space in front of her. Her voice was small, almost broken. "Mommy?" The word pierced the air like glass shattering. The maid's breath caught. The room seemed to tilt. "Sweetheart," her voice shook. "What did you say?" The girl's lips quivered. "I saw her. I think I saw her. Just for a second. She was right there." She pointed toward the beam of light still shimmering across the wall. "She smiled at me." The maid's throat closed. She knelt beside her, hands trembling as she gathered the girl close. "Maybe she was here," she whispered. "Maybe she never left." The girl clung to her, small arms tight around her neck. "Do you think she misses me?" The maid closed her eyes, pressing her cheek to the child's hair. "Every second," she said. "But she's proud of you too. You're seeing the world for both of you now." The girl nodded, still holding on, her small heartbeat quick and wild against the maid's chest. In the doorway, unnoticed, a figure had paused. The billionaire. He stood there silently, a briefcase still in his hand, the faint sound of his keys hitting the floor breaking the moment. The maid turned sharply, eyes wide. The child didn't move, still clinging, still whispering. He stared at them both, confusion cutting through disbelief. "What's happening?" The maid hesitated, caught between fear and truth. "She saw the light," she said softly. "She saw it." The room went utterly still. For a moment, the man didn't move. His face, always a mask of composure, seemed hollowed by something he couldn't yet name. "She saw." His voice trailed off, thin as a whisper. The maid rose slowly, shielding the child a little, her pulse quick under her skin. "Yes," she said. "She followed the light. I've tested her before," quietly. "It isn't a reflex." He stepped closer, disbelief flickering into something sharper. "That's impossible. The specialists were wrong," she interrupted softly. "Or lied." The air between them trembled. The girl, sensing the shift, turned toward the sound of his voice. "Papa?" He dropped to his knees before her, every wall he built collapsing in a heartbeat. "I'm here," he said, but his voice cracked on the words. The maid crouched beside them, holding the phone once more. "Watch," she whispered. She turned on the small flashlight again, guiding it gently across the floor. The child's eyes tracked the beam. The father's breath caught. She moved it closer. The pupils narrowed, following the motion. The girl reached for the glow, fingers brushing the edge of his shoe. "She can see light," the maid said, her tone trembling. Maybe more. But someone didn't want you to know. He stared at his daughter, eyes wide, searching her face for proof that his heart already accepted. How long? I don't know. But the vials in your study. Those are her treatments. They're not. Her words came quickly, urgent now. They're keeping her like this. Sedating her nerves. I found the doctor's name, the same one under investigation years ago. The color drained from his face. Ross, he murmured. Alden Ross. The maid nodded. You trusted him. He looked back to the child, to the eyes he hadn't dared hope for in years. They reflected him now, not perfectly, not fully, but enough that he saw his own outline trembling in them. She smiled faintly, the same small curve he'd memorized as a baby's reflex. Only now he knew it wasn't reflex at all. Papa, she whispered. You look sad. He covered his mouth, laughter and sob tangled in one sound. No, he said softly. No, not sad. Just, he couldn't finish. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close enough that his heartbeat seemed to echo in both of them. The maid turned away, giving them the privacy of that miracle, her eyes wet. For years, this house had been a tomb, a monument to grief. And now, with one beam of light, it was alive again. Outside, clouds broke apart, sunlight spilling over the mansion like a benediction. The father lifted his daughter, still clinging to him, her eyes open toward the light pouring through the window. For the first time, she didn't flinch. He carried her to the window, the same one that had always been closed, curtains drawn like a wound that refused to heal. The maid hesitated, but he gestured for her to open them. Sunlight flooded the room, real sunlight, bright and heavy and alive. The girl's eyelids fluttered but did not shut. Her face tilted upward, as if every golden beam was a word she'd waited years to hear. Can you see it? He whispered. I can feel it, she said. Anne. I think I see something. It's everywhere. He held her tighter, his voice breaking. All this time, he murmured, I thought I was keeping you safe. The maid stepped closer, quiet but firm. You were keeping her hidden, she said gently. Not safe. His shoulders stiffened. Guilt sank into his eyes like shadows into water. I trusted them, he said, more to himself than to her. The treatments, the specialists. I thought I was helping. They used your trust, the maid said. They used her. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioner and the small, contented sigh of the child leaning against his chest. He turned to the maid. How much do you know? Enough to be afraid, she answered. Those vials, they aren't medicine. They dull her nerves. I read about cases like hers. Children in private care used for drug trials because no one questions the powerful. He sank into the armchair by the window, still holding his daughter. My God. The child reached up, small fingers touching his face. Papa, you're crying. He smiled through tears. I am, sweetheart. Because you're seeing the world, and I'm seeing you. The maid swallowed hard, fighting her own tears. You can't let anyone know yet, she said. Not until we understand everything. He nodded, staring at the light stretching across the floor. Then we find the truth. Every part of it. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted apart, leaving the sky impossibly blue. The girl lifted her hand toward it, fingers open in wonder. It's beautiful, she whispered. The maid met the father's eyes. She said it again. He looked down at his daughter and smiled through the ache in his chest. Yes, he said softly. And this time, I believe her. The maid drew the curtains halfway, letting the light remain, a gentle reminder, not a blaze. The girl leaned against her father's shoulder, eyelids growing heavy but still half open, pupils dancing in the sunlight. As the maid turned to leave, she paused in the doorway, watching them bathed in gold. For years, this house had been blind. Now, at last, it could see. I can keep going with the story, but before doing that I need to make sure you're comfortable continuing here. The next section you've planned, Justice/Redemption, involves exposing wrongdoing, investigations, and accountability. I can absolutely write it as a dramatic, emotional continuation that stays suitable for all audiences, no violence or illegal act detail. The next morning, light struck the house differently, no longer soft or forgiving but sharp, revealing. The billionaire hadn't slept. He sat in the study surrounded by open folders, scattered reports, bottles of medicine that clinked whenever his hands shook. The maid stood across from him, quiet, waiting. Every label bore the same name, Dr. Alden Ross. Every date stretched back years. How did I never see this, he murmured. The question was to himself, but she answered anyway. Because you wanted to believe her blindness was fate, not design. He looked up at her, eyes rimmed red. If what you're saying is true, then they've been using my daughter. My money funded this. The words tasted like iron. He grabbed his phone, scrolled through old messages, reminders for appointments, invoices, polite assurances that progress was being made. The same signature closed every note, AR. We'll confront him, the maid said. But not here. Not until you've seen everything. Together they dug through drawers and safes, papers once sealed beneath layers of habit and denial. The deeper they went, the clearer the pattern became. Consultations that never happened, payments that bypassed hospitals, signatures that weren't his. And at the center, one medical authorization stamped with a forged approval from his late wife's foundation. He stared at it for a long time. She wanted to help children see, he whispered. He twisted it. The maid's jaw tightened. Then we'll untwist it. Outside, clouds began to gather, heavy and gray, as though the sky itself were preparing for confrontation. They left the estate by noon, the car slicing through rain-slicked streets toward the private clinic that still bore Dr. Ross's name. Through the glass walls they could see him, immaculate white coat, smile practiced, eyes cold. He didn't recognize the maid, but he froze when he saw the billionaire beside her. "Richard," he exclaimed, arms wide. "What an unexpected." "Save it," Richard said. His voice carried the weight of boardrooms and funerals, sharp enough to silence the lobby. "We're not here for pleasantries." Dr. Ross's gaze flicked to the maid, then back. "I'm afraid I don't understand." She can see. The doctor's face drained of color. "That's impossible." She followed light, the maid said evenly. "And I've seen your records. You didn't heal her, you kept her blind." The doctor's smile faltered, but only for a heartbeat. "You must be mistaken. Some conditions fluctuate." Richard slammed the file onto the counter. Papers spilled, vials rolling like dice. "You poisoned my daughter and sold me hope." The sound of glass vials rolling across the polished floor filled the silence that followed his words. The staff at the clinic froze mid-step, unsure whether to intervene or vanish. Dr. Ross's practiced smile faltered. "Richard, you don't understand. We were following protocol. Your daughter's condition." "Don't call it a condition," Richard snapped. The tone carried the weight of all his years of control, but now it cracked at the edges. "She's a child, not your experiment." The maid stepped forward, voice steady where his trembled. "These drugs suppress her optic nerves. The dosage notes match your own research. You knew what you were doing." The doctor's composure wavered, then hardened. "I saved her from worse outcomes. You think she'd be alive if I hadn't intervened?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Alive isn't the same as living." The doctor straightened, forcing a calm that looked like arrogance. "You signed the consent forms, Richard. Every one of them." He slid a sheet across the counter, Richard's own signature looping in confident ink. The maid stepped closer, studying it. The date was wrong, signed months after the supposed last appointment. "That's forged," she said quietly. "You didn't meet that day. I saw the timestamp on your company's press archive. You were abroad." Ross's eyes flicked toward her, calculating. "And you? A housemaid turned expert witness? You have no place here." "Maybe not," she said, "but I was there when she saw the light." The words hung between them, undeniable. Richard gathered the papers from the floor and turned to the security cameras blinking quietly above them. "If you truly believe this is defensible, you won't mind if we make it public." Ross's facade cracked then, a flash of panic behind the practiced calm. "You wouldn't," he hissed. "I built empires on truth," Richard said, "and destroyed others on lies. You think I won't start with you?" He turned toward the exit, the maid close behind. Staff members parted, murmuring as the pair passed. Outside, the rain had stopped, but thunder still grumbled at the horizon. In the car, the silence between them pulsed with everything that couldn't be said. "What now?" the maid asked. "We don't go to the police yet," Richard said. "They'll bury it under influence and money. We'll go to the media, every document, every signature." "That will destroy him," she said. He looked out the window at the gray skyline. "Good. Then, softer, and it might save others like her." The maid nodded. "I'll gather everything. We'll need proof no one can erase." Richard exhaled, the decision settling on his shoulders like armor. "Then let's give them light," he said. In the reflection of the car window, a streak of sunlight broke through the clouds, brief, blinding, and real. The next days blurred into movement. Richard worked as if possessed, piecing together the fragments of his own betrayal. The maid sat beside him in the study, sorting files, scanning articles, photographing every sheet of evidence before handing it over. Newspapers began to hum with rumors, anonymous leaks, whispers of malpractice, hints that one of the country's most trusted physicians was under scrutiny. Richard's name appeared in the same sentences, but for once he didn't call his lawyers. He let the story grow. By the third day, a journalist waited outside the estate gates. Rain streaked his notepad as he lifted it toward the billionaire emerging from his car. "Sir, is it true your daughter's doctor falsified treatment records?" Richard paused. The old instinct to deflect rose automatically, but he forced it down. "My daughter was never the problem," he said. "The system that let one man play God was." Then he walked past, leaving the journalist blinking in the rain, words already racing toward tomorrow's front page. Inside, the mansion no longer felt heavy. The windows were open again, the curtains tied back. The child sat by the same window with the maid beside her, a sheet of paper on her lap, crayons scattered around. Her drawings were rough shapes, uncertain, but the colors, bright, clumsy strokes of yellow and blue, were unmistakably hers. She said she wanted to draw the light, the maid murmured when Richard entered. He smiled faintly, kneeling beside them. "You did well," he said, though his eyes glistened. "You saw it exactly as it is." That evening, his phone buzzed with a dozen new messages, statements from other families, stories of misdiagnosis, children hidden away. The truth had become contagious. What started as one whisper inside his house now echoed through a city. Dr. Ross held a press conference 2 days later, denying everything. Cameras flashed as he spoke of conspiracies and personal vendettas. But the evidence, the forged signatures, the medical reports, the testimonies, was already public. Each denial only tightened the noose of truth. Richard watched from home, the maid standing quietly beside the television. When the doctor's voice broke under questioning, Richard turned it off. "It's over," she said softly. "No," he answered. "It's beginning." Outside, the sky burned orange with sunset. The child called from the next room, laughter rising clear and bright through the hall. For the first time in years, that sound didn't ache, it healed. Richard looked at the maid. "You brought her back to the world," he said. "And you reminded me how to live in it." She smiled, the faintest curve of humility. "You both just needed to open your eyes." The storm that had shadowed the mansion for years finally passed. The following morning was clear and blue, sunlight gleaming against the marble floors like spilled gold. The house smelled of coffee and fresh lilies, scents it hadn't known since before grief had sealed its doors. Richard stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens. Below him, reporters gathered at the gate, their voices rising in a soft, distant murmur. Somewhere beyond them, justice had begun to take shape, indictments filed, hearings scheduled, names listed under charges he could barely bring himself to read. But inside him, something heavier was beginning to lift. The maid approached quietly, carrying a stack of envelopes, letters from parents, families, strangers. Each one thanking him for speaking out, for refusing to bury the truth beneath money and silence. He took them gently, flipping through the handwritten words. Hope. Gratitude. Grief. It was as if every story his daughter had unknowingly carried had found its way back to him. "She'll never be the same," the maid said softly beside him. "But she'll never be hidden again." He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "She'll have her own light now." Downstairs, the child sat cross-legged by the open window, a sketchbook balanced on her knees. She drew the sun with uncertain lines, its rays uneven but brilliant. Every few strokes she would pause, tilt her head, and smile. When she sensed footsteps behind her, she turned. "Papa?" "I'm here," he said. She reached out, tracing the air until her fingers found his hand. "Is the sky blue today?" "It is," he whispered. "Very blue." She grinned, the kind of smile that carried both innocence and triumph. "Then I'll draw it anyway." He crouched beside her, watching the crayons move, watching color return to his world through hers. The maid lingered in the doorway, unseen but content. She had come into this house to escape her own sorrow, and somehow she had healed someone else's instead. Richard looked up at her, eyes soft. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," she said. "You believed." He nodded slowly. "Belief," he murmured. "The one thing I had all along but never used." Outside, a breeze lifted the curtains, scattering sunlight across the walls. The girls' laughter followed, spilling through the house, alive and fearless. In that sound lived forgiveness, of mistakes, of silence, of all the years lost to darkness. The maid stepped out into the garden. The air smelled clean, washed new by truth. She turned back once, seeing the father and daughter framed in the glow of morning. For the first time since she'd arrived, the mansion didn't look lonely. It looked awake. Spring came early that year. The gardens around the Wakefield mansion were alive again, fresh grass, bright tulips, and sunlight that spilled across every surface like a long-forgotten promise. Windows once shuttered stood open now, their curtains breathing with the wind. Inside, laughter carried through the halls. It was the sound of the child painting again. At a long table near the window, she sat surrounded by jars of color, reds and blues and yellows so bright they seemed to hum. A blank canvas rested before her. The maid sat beside her, rolling up sleeves already smudged with color. "What will you paint today?" she asked. The child smiled, the same patient smile she'd worn the first time she saw the light. "A sky," she said. "But not just blue. I want all the colors the sun hides when it sets." She dipped her brush into yellow, then orange, and dragged it across the canvas in wild strokes that glowed under the afternoon sun. Every motion was confident now. Every color chosen by memory, not sight alone. Across the room, Richard watched quietly, hands in his pockets, the faintest smile touching his face. He no longer wore the sharp suits that once made him look untouchable. His shoulders had softened, his voice had too. In the week since the truth had broken, he'd stepped away from his empire, turning his wealth into foundations for children like his daughter, those hidden by systems that confused care with control. When the painting was finished, the child lifted it proudly. The colors blurred together, imperfect, unbalanced, but beautiful. "What do you think?" she asked. Richard knelt beside her. "I think it's the most honest sky I've ever seen." The maid smiled, her eyes shining. "It looks alive," she said. "It feels alive," the child replied. "Like it's moving." They hung the painting in the hall beside a photograph of her mother, the woman who had believed in light even when she never lived to see it return. The two images, one frozen, one breathing with color, seemed to complete each other. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, they gathered outside. The air was warm, the sky burned gold and crimson. The girl turned her face toward it, eyes half open, catching what light she could. "Papa," she said softly, "is it really that beautiful?" He looked down at her, his heart full. "It's more beautiful than I remember," he said. "But you see it better than any of us ever will." She reached for his hand, her small fingers threading through his. The maid stood behind them, arms folded loosely, smiling as the sky deepened to rose and violet. When darkness finally came, the first stars flickered above the estate. The girl lifted her head. "I can see them," she whispered. "Just little bits, but I can." Richard blinked back tears. "Then promise me something," he said. "Whenever you see light, no matter how faint, follow it." She nodded solemnly. "Always." The maid turned toward the house, her gaze lingering on the warm glow spilling from its windows. She thought of the day she'd first arrived, of silence, grief, and eyes that never moved. Now, every corner shimmered with life. The girl's laughter rose again, bright and effortless, chasing the night away. And in that sound, the mansion found its final peace. Everyone had thought she was born blind. But it turned out, the only blindness that ever existed was the kind that keeps people from seeing the truth, and the light waiting just beyond it.